Sometimes to explain things a little too much is like explaining a joke. It undercuts the impact. But I think it would be a good thing for us here today on this Sunday to think back about the last few Sundays for just a moment. For it sets a stage not only for what we want to do here this morning, but even beyond. If you'll recall, we started off the year remembering our commitment to God, but more importantly, God's covenant to us. Something Methodists have done all the way back to the time of John Wesley. And then we remembered our baptisms together, claimed by God in Christ Jesus. We remembered whom we belong to. And last week we began to focus a little bit more on our stewardship. All of the things that God has placed in our hands, life and opportunities, time, abilities and talents, and yes, resources as well. And it's important that we remember what we're attempting to do, and that is to return to the Scriptures and realize that God has given us much direction about our lives and what they contain. And all of those things are integrated, aren't they? They come back to our faith. Why our faith informs what happens in our homes and families and in our work and in our lives. Our faith really is the root of what we do with all of God's blessings, isn't it? And those lessons of faith throughout the Scriptures inform us throughout our lives. And that's what we have said about stewardship from year to year to year. It's not simply a practical mechanism for funding this or that or the other, but it's a deeply spiritual yearning on our part to deepen our faith and let it touch every area of our lives in obedience to God. And so, we look back this morning at what is one, if not the most important memory that Israel carries with it. A scene of God's salvation and deliverance that foreshadows everything that's going to happen in Christ. And they return to it again and again and again as a reminder of the importance of faith, but even more importantly, that they belong to God. And it is, of course, the Exodus, the exit from Egypt that's filled with God's miraculous presence. And so we want to look together at this wonderful story of God's deliverance, of God's presence, and learn from it something about our faith, some principles of faith, if you will, that extend out to our stewardship and how we live. But everything comes from this fountainhead of a deep faith and abiding trust in God. And for all of the Scriptures, it comes back to this foundational and important event. So look with me, if you will. The story begins long before this. The story continues after it. But we take a snapshot view of what I'm sure you have some images in mind of. And that is Pharaoh and the Egyptians closing in on Moses, the children of Israel, as they are in that spot between the devil and the deep blue sea, as the expression goes. There they are with the sea on one side and the Egyptians closing in on the other. And listen to what happens, and let's learn together something that we might apply to our faith and grow in. In Exodus chapter 14, we pick up the scene in verses 10 through 18. Follow along or listen, if you'd like, to this part of the story. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone, and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. But you, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the Israelites may go into the sea on dry ground. Then I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they will go in after them. And so I will gain glory for myself over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots and his chariot drivers. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained glory for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his chariot drivers." If you think about the background of this for just a moment, we have said that here are the Israelites, a little hesitant at times, but under Moses' leadership, they have traveled out of Egypt, out of slavery. God has taken them on purpose through a roundabout way, that they might not suddenly turn back to Egypt, for he knows how hesitant they are. And here they are encamped against the sea. They've already experienced and seen so many miracles. But now they are in grave danger. In fact, if you can enter into the moment, think for a moment about what it might be like to be just moments from absolute annihilation. You see, that's the scene here. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. And the writer of Exodus says, "In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord." Can you imagine what it might be like to be just moments from annihilation? Imagine the scene. They could see the gleam of the swords and the spears. They could hear the sound of the horses, the thunder of the chariots. They could see the whites of their eyes, if you will. The Egyptians were that close. Can you imagine what it's like? In great fear, they cried to the Lord. And that really brings us to the first of three great hurdles, if you will, three great obstacles that we face in deepening our faith, that it might reach out in a living way and affect and transform all of our lives. And the first, you might have guessed it, is fear. Can there be a greater picture of fear than the Israelites staring down the Egyptians, almost defenseless? They have very few, if any, weapons. And here they are facing a trained and formidable army bearing down on them, just a few moments from what looks like surely the end. Now, we may not have experienced fear quite in that way. But fear is fear. We've experienced fear perhaps in similar ways, and it is the greatest obstacle to faith. Thomas Ellsworth was a private in a parachute regiment in the Army. And he wrote about going on a nighttime exercise on one occasion. He said he was seated next to a young officer, and that young officer looked very pale and fidgety. It was his first nighttime jump. And so he said, I looked over and I said, are you scared, Lieutenant? The lieutenant said, no, I'm not scared. A few moments of silence went by and he said, you certainly look scared, Lieutenant. He said, I'm not scared. A few moments went by, and he said, well, then what are you? What do you mean, what am I? Well, if you're not scared, you don't look so good. What are you? He said, well, I'm apprehensive. I said, well, Lieutenant, what's the difference between being apprehensive and being scared? He said, apprehensive means I'm scared to death with a university education. You see, fear cuts across everything that we know as human beings. It cuts across our status. It cuts across what we know. It cuts across all of our experiences. All of us confront fear. I've been reading recently some famous letters throughout history. It's a fascinating book. And one of the topics in there is letters from those who have faced imminent death. Francis Bacon, imprisoned in the Tower of London, who believes he is going to be executed the very next morning. The great Russian author Dostoevsky, who believes that he is going to be executed and in fact is led out and is one of several who watch as his comrades are led and tied to a post in front of a firing squad. Everything is said, and then at the last possible moment, their sentence is commuted, and he writes a letter. He says, there has never been a time when I have felt as dust. As if this is it. You may have been in a similar situation, but we all face fear. The fear of annihilation, that something is going to do us in. This is it. This is the end of it all. And so the Hebrews complain. This is it. Moses, why did you take us out into the desert? As soon as they cry out to God, they turn to Moses. It's as if what they think is going to happen has already happened. But you see, we know in the story that God has told Moses he plans to save Israel. He plans to defeat Pharaoh and his army. It's just not right yet. They don't know how, but he's told Moses already. You see, there's this brilliant contrast between fear and faith. Unbelief and faith. You see, what's interesting is that they both see something in the future. They both project ahead. They both envision what's next. Fear does that, as well as faith. The only difference is that fear, unbelief, looks in the future, projects ahead, envisions what's next, but God is nowhere in it. Faith does the same thing. It looks ahead, it projects ahead, it envisions what's next, but with God's presence manifest.